Enough of that. Let's move on to China. This is the big story of the day. And, you know, in some senses, this may be the defining story of the century. Now, after landing in Beijing earlier this evening, tomorrow is, by the way, the big day. Anthony Albanese gets to see Xi Jinping again. And you got to feel bad for the Prime Minister because this was all supposed to be such a big and special event. Yes, the Prime Minister was supposed to go to sleep tonight in his absolutely not bugged hotel suite with visions of being called a handsome boy dancing in his head. But Albanese's apparent pivot to China could be knocked off balance by some very recent history and his own doing. I want to remind you of this little moment from the last federal election campaign. Remember this? When the Prime Minister barged onto ABC Talk Radio in Darwin at 4:12 p.m. in the afternoon, all because he was trying to beat Peter Dutton to the punch about an announcement about the Port of Darwin.
Could you write the headline for me on this announcement today?
Australia needs to own the Port of Darwin.
So are you buying back the lease of the Port of Darwin or not?
Well, what we're doing is trying to see if there's a private buyer through particularly superannuation funds that we've had discussions with.
You have had 3 years, Prime Minister, to deal with the port lease. What would you say to local voters who might see this as an election stunt?
That is something that we have had a consistent view on.
Well, they had a consistent view on it. Not that they did anything about it for the first 3 years that they were in government, and it somehow only became an issue in the minutes, the literal minutes, before Peter Dutton, the then opposition leader, was supposed to announce the coalition's own policy on the Port of Darwin. You got to ask, why didn't they do something about it before? But hey, you know what they say, no time like the present. Now, this seemed like a clever bit of campaigning, but now this has come back to bite Albanese. The whole thing seems to be putting a little bit of a damper, that's right, on his trip. There was a little warning in the Chinese social media from a Chinese social media influencer today who, you bet, cleared this post with head office. There's a guy called Liu Wenjing, and he used to edit a Chinese propaganda rag called Voice of the Strait. And he put it out there on Chinese social media that any attempt to retake the port could provoke countermeasures. His words. He has written, quote, if the Australian side insists on tearing up the lease agreement, the Chinese side may take countermeasures, such as, well, restricting Australian companies' market access in China or tightening imports of key resources such as iron ore, unquote. Well, you know, we've seen this movie before, and we all remember how that all played out under the Morrison government. But it seems like now that poor Anthony Albanese is in the chair, all this foreign policy stuff, it's really hard. And he can't seem to catch a break because, guess what? He's been copying it for being too soft on the Chinese. Now he's copying it from China for being too tough on them. He can't win. The Prime Minister was asked about this at a press conference in Shanghai today.
Can I ask you, are you concerned about that kind of blowback if you go through with your election commitment?
The answer to that is no. We had a very clear position that we want the port to go into Australian ownership. We've been clear about it. We've been orderly about it. And we will go through that process.
The whole press conference there in Shanghai was absolutely fascinating because the Prime Minister was flanked by business leaders like Twiggy Forrest, all eager to do more business in China. But the big elephant in the room, the fact that China is a totalitarian state with aims to dominate the Pacific, if not the globe, well, that couldn't be ignored. And I have to say credit to this journalist in the press pack who asked this question, picking up on the theme that we talked about last night. That is, just what and are not the actions of a friend?
What is your message about the circumnavigation of Australia by the Chinese flotilla, live fire drills and suspected surveillance ships now watching Talisman Sabre? Is this an act of a friend?
With regard to the second question, that would be nothing unusual that has happened in the past. And I'll continue to assert Australia's national interest as I do.
Nothing unusual that has happened in the past. Well, okay. I mean, look, lots of things have happened in the past. Pearl Harbor happened in the past. The Black Death happened in the past. Bastille Day, which the French celebrate today, that happened in the past. But that doesn't mean we just brush these things aside. I mean, this answer here that the Prime Minister gave here is disgraceful, and it is part of this incredible pattern that he seems to have of any time China does anything that is offensive to Australian interests, to Western interests, to the interests of liberal democracies, he says, oh, well, you know, stuff kind of happens, you know, ships circumnavigate Australia all the time, ships fire off missiles all the time, these sorts of things happen. But of course, when it's the West, when it's the United States, when it's Donald Trump, who we'll talk about in a moment, well, that is not the action of a friend. Anyway, I don't know if the Sky News app, by the way, download it if you haven't already because it is absolutely great. I don't know if that app works in China, but the traveling press pack also noticed another thing we talked about last night, and that is the subtle positioning of labor towards China and away from the U.S. Though whether that's now going to happen with Darwin on the table, we'll see.
Just to go back to what you were saying before about stability with China, Xi Jinping, President Xi, seems to be positioning China as a more stable alternative. Is that an assessment that you share? And that's an alternative to the US, to clarify.
Look, I don't draw alternatives. What I do is I want to see a stable and secure region. I think that's in the interest of everyone in the Indo-Pacific, but that's an approach I take to global politics as well.
Stable. That's, Prime Minister, do you understand what is going on here? All right? Stability is not good if that means that China winds up dominating the Pacific, because you know what? That's not good for us here in Australia. Stability is actually quite bad if it means that China's strength and power winds up growing in the Pacific. What's necessary here, I think, is to understand the fact that sometimes in life you need to pick your friends, stick with them, and push back. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to fight a war, but it does mean you're going to stand up for Australian interests which are closely tied to not only the United States, but of liberal democracies around the world. And included in that has to be the country of Taiwan, which is, of course, under constant threat from the People's Republic of China. Now, this is a thing. This is not, Prime Minister, I hope you're watching, a both sides issue. You cannot both sides this question. And I want to bring this in here because earlier today I had a chat to John Lee. Now, he's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he is, among other things, was the foreign minister's lead advisor on the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. Now, I talked to him for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, and you can read more about this in tomorrow's paper. But this line he told me struck me, and I wanted to share it with you now. John Lee told me, quote, "It is one thing to assert Australian diplomatic independence. China, not Trump's America, is the dangerous and more serious structural disruption to regional and global peace and stability. That Anthony Albanese seems more comfortable with Chinese policy rather than U.S. policy is something he needs to explain to the Australian electorate." And moreover, John Lee said there was a bipartisan mindset only a few years ago that Australia needed to diversify its economic interests away from China for the sake of national resilience and as a hedge against Chinese economic coercion, which will occur again in the future. Anthony Albanese, he said, seems to have abandoned that position, unquote. Well, how true that is. And I mean, seriously, don't you remember when COVID happened? And I don't want to talk about COVID, but when that happened, That was the big thing that we talked about. We said, universities, get off the drip with Chinese students, diversify yourself. Everybody, supply chains, don't get everything from China. The risk is just too big. Everything coming from China, well, we know the position that puts you into, and that was the position that we were put into week one. As a result of that, we said as a nation, we're not going to do that anymore. But apparently, here we are, and without any consultation or taking it to the election or having a, national conversation, to use one of my least favorite expressions, we are going all in on China, more trade with China, not less. Okay, well, let's give the Prime Minister for a moment the benefit of the doubt on this, because he does seem to be stuck in this old mindset that says if the West, if Australia just has enough free trade with China, China will become a freer and more peaceful nation. Well, this is a mistake that has driven decades of China policy through allowing Beijing to join the WTO, through the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square disaster, to the great cover-up around COVID and everything else, from influence buying scandals to the theft of intellectual property and so much more. We know that this whole idea that if we just expose the totalitarian Chinese communist government to Western liberal democracy and trade with them and the people get rich, well, that they're going to become more liberal, that hasn't worked. It has been just the opposite. This was a fantasy that we would, and in fact, what has happened, honestly, if you think about it, is we've become a bit more like China than China has become like us. And you don't need to go very far to see examples of that. We saw that start during COVID, and we see it today with the increasing realms of internet surveillance and the e-safety commissioner and the Great Australian Firewall that's coming our way.